The day the trouble started, the sky over Milford, Montana looked like it had been bruised. A streak of purple clouds sat low over the horizon, pressing down on the town like a hand trying to keep something hidden. The last sunlight glinted off the wet pavement in front of my small rental house, and I remember thinking it looked almost too pretty to belong to the kind of day I'd had. I was halfway through folding laundry when the knock came. 3 short raps, not hurried, not polite, more like someone testing to see if I was alone. I froze for a second. In Milford, folks didn't usually knock at sunset unless something was wrong. My rent was due in 2 days, and I'd been putting off a conversation I knew I couldn't avoid forever. My landlord, Thomas Gray, was the kind of man who could read a lie on your face before you even opened your mouth. He owned 3 properties in town, but everyone knew his heart belonged to the old 2-story brick building at the edge of Main Street. His family home turned into a set of small rentals after his wife passed. I set the laundry basket down, brushed my hair back, and opened the door, and there he was, tall, in his early 40s, with that quiet sort of presence that made you want to stand straighter. He wore his work jacket, the heavy brown canvas one with a tear near the left cuff, and a look that said he'd come here on purpose, not by accident. "Evening, Claire," he said, voice low, steady. "Evening," I answered, gripping the edge of the door. "Something wrong?" He studied me for a second, his eyes catching on the half-empty coffee mug on the counter behind me, the folded pile of laundry, the light that was dying in the room. Then he said, "Mind if I come in? We need to talk." The weight of what I owed Thomas had never been unkind to me. In fact, when I moved in last spring after my divorce, he was the first person in Milford to offer help without asking for something in return. He'd even fixed my porch light himself, refusing to take the $20 I tried to hand him. But kindness from a landlord can be tricky. You never know if it's generosity or if they're just waiting for the right moment to cash it in. I stepped aside, letting him in. The room felt smaller with him in it, not because of his size, but because of the silence he carried. Thomas didn't fill spaces with chatter. He filled them with his presence. "I'm guessing you know why I'm here," he said finally. I took a slow breath. "Rent," he nodded. "Rent." I hated how small my voice sounded. "I can get you most of it by Friday. You've been saying just for 3 months now, Claire." His tone wasn't harsh, but it cut right through me. I don't run this place to make people's lives harder, but I've got bills too. Taxes, repairs. The furnace in the upstairs unit's about to go, and winter's not exactly far away. My mind scrambled for something, anything, that didn't sound like an excuse. But the truth was, since the diner cut my hours, I'd been walking a tightrope between groceries, gas, and keeping the lights on. "I'm not asking for charity," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just need—" He held up a hand. "I'm not here to throw you out, but I need to know you're not digging yourself deeper." The last light from the window stretched across his face, catching the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. He wasn't just my landlord in that moment. He was a man measuring whether he could trust me. An unexpected offer. Thomas set his work gloves on the table and looked at me like he'd already decided something. "I've got a side project I've been putting off. The barn out at my family's old place needs clearing out before winter. You help me with that this week, and I'll knock $200 off what you owe." I blinked. "You're offering me work?" "I'm offering you a way to breathe a little easier." There was no pity in his voice, and that made it harder to say no. Pride is a strange thing. It keeps you from drowning, but it also keeps you from grabbing the rope someone throws. I thought of my dwindling bank balance, of the cold nights creeping in, of the way my son Tyler's shoes had started to pinch at the toes. "I'll do it," I said. Thomas gave one short nod as if sealing a deal. "Tomorrow, I'll pick you up at 8. And then he left just like that. No lingering, no small talk. The quiet between us. The next morning, the frost clung to the grass like it didn't want to let go. Thomas's old blue pickup rumbled into my driveway right on time. Tyler was at school, so I locked up the house and climbed in beside him. We didn't speak much on the drive. The road wound out of town, past the rusted grain silo, past the field where wild horses sometimes appeared at dusk. I kept stealing glances at him, at the way his hands rested steady on the wheel, at the faint smudge of sawdust near his collar. There was something about him that made you want to know the rest of the story. When we reached the barn, I saw what he meant by clearing out. It was like stepping into a frozen moment from decades ago. Dust motes drifted in the light, slanting through the warped boards. There were old wooden crates, a broken rocking chair, shelves lined with glass jars whose labels had long faded. "My dad built this place before I was born," Thomas said quietly. "After he passed, Mom couldn't bring herself to get rid of his things. I heard the unspoken, and neither could I. We worked for hours, the air filling with the scent of dry hay and old wood. At first, the silence between us felt like work, just the sound of boots on the floor, of things being shifted and sorted. But slowly, it started to feel like something else, like the space where two people decide whether they can trust each other. At one point, I found a tin box under a pile of burlap sacks. When I opened it, there was a faded photograph inside. Thomas, as a young boy, maybe 6 or 7, sitting on the shoulders of a man who must have been his father. He glanced at it and smiled faintly. "Haven't seen that in years." "You look just like him," I said before I could stop myself. "Yeah," he murmured. "That's what Mom used to say." For a moment the barn felt warmer. By the time the sun dipped low again, we'd cleared most of the main floor. My arms ached and dust clung to my hair, but there was a strange lightness in me. Thomas handed me a bottle of water and leaned against the doorframe, looking out at the field beyond. "200 off," he said simply. "And you did good work today." It wasn't much, but somehow it felt like the start of something I couldn't quite name. And when he drove me home, neither of us mentioned that he'd stayed a few seconds longer than necessary in the driveway before I stepped out. The morning sun in Copper Ridge didn't rush to rise. It lingered behind the eastern hills, filtering its light through the tall cottonwoods that lined the 2-lane road into town. Claire woke to the faint hum of Eli's truck somewhere outside, the low rumble blending with the sound of sparrows darting past her open window. She sat on the edge of her bed for a moment, her bare feet pressing into the warm wooden floor. The events of yesterday, the storm, the road, the unexpected reunion, played in her mind like scenes from a dream she wasn't ready to wake from. She could still hear Eli's voice in the cab, that quiet, "You all right?" that had seemed to reach deeper than just concern for a stranger. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a message from her assistant in Denver, reminding her of an investor call at 10. Claire sighed. In the city, her days were packed, predictable, and utterly in her control. Out here, nothing felt predictable, and that was both unsettling and, in a strange way, magnetic. She walked to the small kitchen of the rental cabin, poured herself a mug of coffee, and stepped out onto the porch. Across the gravel drive, she could see Eli leaning under the hood of his truck, a wrench in hand, sleeves pushed up to reveal strong forearms dusted with grease. He caught her looking, and for a heartbeat, they just stood there. Two people on opposite sides of a morning that felt heavier than it should. "Truck giving you trouble?" she called, trying to keep her voice light. He wiped his hands on a rag and straightened. "Nothing I can't handle. I was just making sure she's ready for the week. These back roads'll eat your ride alive if you're not careful." Claire smiled faintly, but her mind wasn't on his truck. It was on that moment in high school, years ago, when they'd both been lost during the fall camping trip. How they'd stumbled upon a clearing lit only by moonlight, shivering under the same blanket, his hand brushing hers with hesitant warmth. It had been a single night, one they'd never spoken of again, yet it had lived rent-free in her memory ever since. "Hey," Eli's voice broke her thoughts. "I've got to head into town for some parts. If you're still planning on getting your car looked at, I can give you a lift." The sensible thing would be to say no, to call the local towing service, to keep her distance. But the sensible thing felt a little too much like the life she'd been living for years. "Sure," she said, "let me grab my bag." The ride into town was quiet at first, the hum of the tires filling the silence. But as the fields rolled by and the sky opened up into that endless Montana blue, the conversation began to slip into easier places. Old classmates, forgotten haunts, the diner that still served the best huckleberry pie in 3 counties. And beneath it all, unspoken but unmistakable, was the weight of what they hadn't said for over a decade. When they reached the garage, Eli pulled up to the side entrance. "I'll have it checked out this afternoon," he told her. "You can hang around if you want, or—" His voice trailed off, as though he wasn't sure he had the right to ask more of her time. Claire met his eyes. "I'll hang around." It was a simple answer, but in her chest it felt like a door quietly swinging open. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil, sawdust, and the kind of honest labor that left your clothes stained, but your conscience clean. Claire leaned against the counter near the front, watching through the open bay door as Eli crouched by her car, sleeves rolled up again, his brow furrowed in quiet concentration. Outside, Copper Ridge moved at its own unhurried pace. A boy pedaled past on a bike too small for him. Across the street, the hardware store owner swept dust from his front steps. Everything here seemed to belong to another time, one where people still knew each other's middle names and remembered what brand of pie you liked at the diner. "Looks like your alternator's on its last leg," Eli said after a while, straightening with a rag in his hand. "It's not the kind of thing I can patch for long. I can get a replacement in tomorrow." Claire nodded. "I guess that means I'm stuck here a little longer." "Could be worse," he said with a half smile. She laughed softly, but it faded quickly, replaced by something more thoughtful. "You ever think about that night at the campsite?" Eli's hands stilled. For a moment, the only sound was the creak of a wrench settling on the workbench. He didn't look at her right away. "Yeah," he said finally, "more than I probably should." The confession sat between them, unpolished and raw. Claire felt her chest tighten, not from regret, but from the sudden, undeniable fact that she hadn't been alone in remembering. "It's strange," she murmured. "We didn't even kiss, but it felt like—" She trailed off, searching for the right word. "Like something started," Eli finished for her. His voice was low, steady, but there was something fragile in it. Claire looked down at her coffee, the steam curling up like the breath she'd been holding all these years. "And then life happened." "Yeah," he said, almost under his breath. A bell above the door jingled, breaking the moment. An older man walked in, greeted Eli with a nod, and dropped off a small box of parts. Claire stepped back, letting them talk, but her mind was still caught in that invisible thread, the one that stretched from a moonlit clearing in their youth to this dusty garage in the heart of Copper Ridge. When the man left, Eli turned back to her. "There's a fall festival tonight over at the fairgrounds. Bonfire, music, pie contest. The whole deal. Might be something to pass the time while you're stuck here." She hesitated, sensing that the invitation wasn't just about the festival. "I'll go," she said. Eli's smile this time was quieter, but it reached his eyes. And in that moment, Claire realized that being stuck in Copper Ridge might not be a problem at all. The fairgrounds were a patchwork of light and shadow, strung with bare bulbs that swayed gently in the cool evening air. The scent of wood smoke from the bonfire mingled with kettle corn and cinnamon. Somewhere near the center, a fiddler played an old tune that felt like it had been carried through generations. Claire walked beside Eli, her boots crunching on gravel. She'd borrowed a flannel from the back seat of her car, and though it was a little worn, it was warm enough against the crisp October breeze. "You know," she said softly, "I haven't been to one of these in years." Eli glanced at her, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Some things don't change much. Same pie contest, same folks trying to outdo each other on pumpkin carving. They wandered past a row of tables lined with pies. A woman with silver hair offered them each a slice of apple, and Claire accepted. The first bite was warm, sweet, and somehow more comforting than she expected. "This is dangerously good," she said. "That's Mrs. Colburn's. She's been winning first place since I was 12. They found themselves near the bonfire, its flames throwing gold light onto Eli's face. Claire noticed how the glow caught in his eyes, making them look deeper, softer. She tried not to stare too long, but it was harder than she wanted to admit. Around them, conversations hummed. Laughter floated in the air, but it felt like there was a quiet bubble between them, untouched by the noise. "You remember that night in the woods?" Eli asked suddenly, his voice almost lost under the crackle of the fire. Claire's heart skipped. "I remember the way the air smelled, like pine and rain. I remember the way you looked at me," he said. Her throat tightened. "And then we both pretended it didn't happen." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached down and picked up a small twig, tossing it into the fire. "Maybe I didn't want to pretend. Maybe I just didn't know what to do with it." The words hit her harder than she expected, because she understood completely. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the embers swirl upward like tiny red stars. "Claire," Eli said quietly, "you ever wonder what might have happened if things had gone different?" She looked at him, her breath catching. "All the time, and though no one else would have noticed, something shifted then. Something subtle, but irreversible. The walk back from the festival was quieter than the walk there. The night had settled deep over the town, wrapping everything in a kind of stillness that made each footstep sound louder than it should. The street lamps along the road cast soft halos of light, and between them there was only darkness. Claire kept her hands tucked into her pockets, partly for warmth, partly so she wouldn't be tempted to reach out and touch him. Beside her, Eli had his hands in the pockets of his jacket, his shoulders slightly hunched against the chill. Neither of them spoke at first. The words they'd traded by the bonfire still lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. When they reached the small motel on the edge of town, Claire stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Thanks for walking me back." Eli nodded, but didn't turn to leave. "Claire," she looked at him, and in that moment, it was as if the years between them folded up and disappeared. He wasn't the man who fixed engines in a dusty garage. He was the boy who had found her in the dark woods years ago, the boy who had kissed her with rain dripping off his hair. "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say right now," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything," she replied, though her voice was softer than she meant it to be. The wind stirred, carrying the faint smell of pine from the hills beyond town. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked. She didn't pretend not to understand. Every now and then, his gaze dropped to the wooden step between them, then lifted again. "I've thought about it more than I probably should have." There it was, the truth stripped down to its barest form. Claire's breath caught, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then, almost without thinking, she stepped closer. The space between them shrank to just inches. She could feel the warmth radiating off him, see the way the shadows traced the line of his jaw. But she didn't kiss him. Not yet. She wasn't sure if she was ready, or if she just wanted to make this moment last longer. "Good night, Eli," she whispered. He hesitated before answering, his voice low. "Good night, Claire." He turned and walked away, his figure fading into the darkness. She stood there a moment longer, listening to the sound of his footsteps until they were gone. When she finally went inside, her pulse was still quick, her thoughts tangled. She knew, without a doubt, that tonight had changed something between them. The morning came with pale, silvery light streaming through the motel curtains. Claire lay awake long before she got up, her thoughts looping back to the quiet moment on the steps last night. The way Eli had looked at her, the weight behind his words. She told herself she was here for work. She told herself she could keep this professional. She didn't entirely believe it. By late morning, her rental car was due for the final repairs Eli had promised. She walked down the narrow main road toward the garage, the sound of her boots crunching on gravel, mixing with the faint hum of life in a small town. A screen door slamming somewhere, the bark of a dog, the low rumble of a passing pickup. The garage sat at the far end of the street, a squat building with wide open doors and the smell of oil and metal spilling out. Inside, Eli was bent over the hood of her car, his hands deep in the engine, his shirt sleeves pushed up to his elbows. He glanced up when she stepped in. "Morning." "Morning," she echoed, though her voice came out softer than she intended. He wiped his hands on a rag, avoiding her gaze for just a second too long. "Your car's just about ready. Figured I'd take it for a quick test drive once I'm done." "That's fine." She walked farther in, the warmth from the space heaters mixing with the colder air from outside. For a while, neither of them said much. She sat on an overturned crate, watching him work. There was something almost hypnotic about the way his hands moved, confident, precise, like he knew every inch of the machine. Finally, he spoke without looking at her. "About last night." Her breath caught. "What about it?" He set the rag aside. I don't want you thinking I meant something I didn't." "And what did you mean?" she asked, her voice low, careful. He hesitated, then met her eyes. "That I still think about you. More than I should. And that maybe I'm not great at hiding it." Her chest tightened. There it was again, the truth, plain and unpolished. Before she could respond, the sound of tires on gravel cut through the moment. A dusty red pickup rolled up outside the garage. A tall man in a work jacket stepped out, calling Eli's name. "Looks like I've got to take care of this first," Eli said quietly, his expression unreadable. She nodded, but as he walked away to greet the newcomer, Claire knew one thing for certain. Whatever was building between them, it wasn't going away. If anything, it was pulling them closer, whether they were ready or not. The afternoon sky turned strange by the time Eli finished with her car. Low, heavy clouds rolling in from the mountains, the kind that carried both the smell of rain and a promise you couldn't quite name. Claire stood outside the garage while he took the rental for a spin down the empty road. The wind had picked up, tossing her hair across her face, carrying with it that faint metallic tang of an approaching storm. When he returned, he stepped out and leaned against the driver's side door. "Run smooth now. Shouldn't give you any more trouble." She looked past him to the horizon where the clouds kept stacking higher. "I might wait a bit before heading out. Don't really feel like driving into that." Eli glanced at the sky, then back at her. "Could show you a place to wait it out. Little scenic pull-off up in the hills. You can see the whole valley from there." It was an odd suggestion. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just him finding a way to keep her here a little longer. Either way, she didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." They drove in separate vehicles, winding up a narrow, tree-lined road that twisted into the foothills. The rain held off for the first 10 minutes, but the light dimmed quickly, the clouds swallowing the sun. When they reached the overlook, she parked beside him and stepped out. The view stretched for miles, the town below, the ribbon of river curling through it, and beyond that, the dark, rolling expanse of forest and peaks. "This is where I used to come when I needed to think," Eli said quietly, standing beside her. "Even before that night." She didn't ask which night. She didn't have to. The wind shifted, carrying the first cool drops of rain. She could feel him looking at her, but she kept her gaze fixed on the valley. "I used to think," he went on, "that what happened between us was a mistake. Not because I didn't want it, but because wanting it made everything complicated." Her pulse quickened. And now, he said, his voice lower, "I think it's one of the few things I've never regretted." The rain picked up, a steady patter against the metal roofs of their cars. Neither of them moved toward shelter. Instead, she turned to face him. The years fell away in that instant, the memories rushing in, the firelight in the woods, the way his hands had trembled just slightly, the heat of his breath when he'd whispered her name. The thunder cracked somewhere far off, but it felt close, everything did. "Eli," she began, but her words tangled with the rain and the wind. He took a step closer, and she didn't step back. The rain came harder, the kind that made the horizon blur and turned the air into a curtain of silver threads. Eli glanced toward the cars. "There's an old ranger's cabin just down the trail. Roof still holds, last I checked." She followed him without thinking, their footsteps muffled on the wet pine needles. The trail was narrow, the smell of damp earth and cedar heavy in the air. By the time they reached the cabin, a squat wooden structure with peeling paint, both of them were drenched. Inside, it smelled faintly of dust and rain-soaked wood. Light seeped through the cracks in the shutters, dim and fractured. There was a bench against the far wall and a small table littered with forgotten nails and rusted hinges. Eli shut the door against the wind. "Didn't think we'd be here again," he said. "Here?" she asked, wiping water from her hair. He gave her a look, steady, knowing. "A place like this, a storm. Us." Her chest tightened. The years dissolved even more sharply now, replaced by the ghost of another night. The forest shelter, the firelight flickering across his face, the sound of rain on canvas. She sat on the bench, feeling the wood cool beneath her. "Back then, I thought about it for weeks, months even." "What did you think about?" His voice was quiet, but it carried. She hesitated. How it started. How it felt like it was going to change everything. And it did. Eli stepped closer, his wet shirt clinging to him, the scent of rain and pine clinging too. "I've replayed it more times than I'll admit, the way you looked at me, like maybe you saw me the way I wanted to be seen." Lightning flashed, briefly painting the cabin in white light. When the darkness fell back in, it felt heavier. He sat beside her, not touching, not yet, but close enough that the heat of him reached her through the damp. The rain roared on the roof, drowning out the rest of the world. "You left," he said finally, his tone not accusing, just bare. "I had to," her voice wavered, "and maybe I thought, if I stayed, I wouldn't have been able to leave at all." Silence stretched between them, thick, charged. When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. The warmth of his fingers was startling against her cold skin. "You're here now," he said. Her breath caught. "Yeah, I am." Outside, the storm kept them pinned in place. Inside, something long buried began to shift, like a door she'd closed years ago, quietly unlocking. The wind rattled the shutters, the sound deep and hollow like an old memory trying to speak. Savannah sat with her hand still in Eli's, feeling the pulse in his thumb, slow, steady, grounding her in a way nothing had in years. The cabin smelled of damp pine and faint ash, as if someone long ago had left a fire smoldering in its hearth. The air between them was warmer now, but not from the weather. "I used to wonder," Eli's voice was low, deliberate, "if that night was just a moment for you, something you could tuck away and forget." Her throat tightened. "You really think I could forget?" He gave a small, almost bitter laugh. "I didn't know. You went off to a different life, fancy places, city lights, and I stayed here. Same dirt roads, same stars. Felt like you disappeared into another world." Savannah looked at him fully, seeing the lines in his face that time had carved. "I didn't forget. I carried it, and every time I tried to set it down, it found its way back." Another crack of lightning lit the room for a breath, throwing their shadows across the walls. Two figures drawn closer than they'd realized. Eli reached up, brushing a strand of wet hair from her cheek. His touch was gentle, tentative, like he was asking a question without words. Savannah didn't move away. "You're shaking," he murmured. It's not the cold. The words hung there, heavier than the storm outside. Something broke then. Not sudden, but slow, like ice thawing. Eli leaned in just enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath, his eyes searching hers for permission. When she didn't stop him, he kissed her. Soft at first, as if to test the ground beneath them. The years between them collapsed in that single moment, leaving only the echo of who they'd been and the pull of who they still were to each other. Her hands found the sides of his face, holding him there, not ready to let go. The rain became a distant drumbeat, the cabin their own small, unlit world. They didn't speak. Words would have broken it. Morning came slow. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving the world washed clean, but the air inside the cabin still held the night's warmth. Savannah stirred first. Her head rested against Eli's shoulder, his arm heavy around her waist. For a moment she didn't move, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, the steady rise and fall that felt too natural, too familiar, as if this had been her place all along. But then reality began to tap at the edges of her mind. The world beyond these walls still existed. Her life, her choices, her distance from this man and this town. Eli's eyes opened slowly, finding hers. No smile, no rush of words, just that quiet knowing. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "Morning." They lay there a little longer, neither willing to be the first to let go. Outside, sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, striping the floorboards with gold. Finally, Savannah sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around her. "We should probably get back." "Yeah," Eli said softly, though his tone carried the weight of something unsaid. She dressed in silence, the sound of fabric against skin loud in the stillness. Eli busied himself with the small fire, stirring the embers even though they didn't need tending. When she stepped toward the door, she hesitated, turned back. "Eli," he met her eyes, waiting. "That night in the woods, years ago, I thought it was the only time we'd ever have. I don't know what last night means, but I know I'll carry it with me, just like I carried the first one." He nodded slowly, as if he understood completely. "Then I guess we're both carrying something." They walked out into the soft, wet morning. The air smelled of pine and fresh earth. Somewhere in the distance, the road back to town waited, but neither of them was ready to take it just yet. They stood there a moment longer, side by side, the cabin at their back, the future uncertain. And then, without another word, they began to walk.